what does it mean in terms of integrated planning? Well, before I dig into that, for those of you who are not familiar with the concept of SUMP, so Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans, it is a continual integrated planning process at the local or regional level to increase urban accessibility and quality of life, which is often summarized in a policy document, so the SUMP guidelines. And the guidelines are intended for widest possible use and can be used free of charge, and adaptation to local planning needs is also, of course, encouraged, and it's an important milestone in the take-up of new planning culture in Europe. So it's based on 8 principles that tackle implementation of a sustainable mobility plan involving citizens and stakeholders, but also ensuring quality and arranging for monitoring and evaluation. In those guidelines, Rupprecht Consult, among other actors, have developed the SUMP cycle that provides key steps in the creation and implementation of an SUMP with specific activities to guide any practitioner in developing a plan. During COVID-19, a practitioner briefing was developed by the actors stated on this slide, and to understand the correlation between SUMP and COVID-19. And the past months have proven the importance of SUMPs in tackling emergency situations. So SUMPs have established trust between urban mobility stakeholders, established decision-making procedures, and put structures in place for implementing measures. The SUMP process has provided cities with a portfolio of fit-for-purpose measures to be fast-tracked to combat the impact of COVID-19 on mobility in urban centers, but also create opportunities for people to make best use of the city and its public spaces. So COVID-19 has impacted integrated planning processes. In particular, more agile planning is required, and a built-in ability to adjust comprehensive or sector plans was needed, and processed to take into account threats and opportunities. Overall, it represents an opportunity for better new normal. So the COVID-19 practitioner briefing was developed in June 2020 and includes lessons learned for immediate, short-term and long-term actions that European cities and regions were developing, and provides a first quick scan of good practices example. Following this practitioner briefing, Rupprecht Consult and Polis has worked on a topic guide linking the concept of SUMP with the concept of resilience to go beyond the COVID-19 practitioner briefing and try to introduce the concept of integrated mobility planning and crisis management. So resilience is a broad and sometimes a bit hard to grasp concept, but overall it describes the capacity of a system to resist, adapt itself, and transform itself to recover from a shock and absorb its consequences and maintain levels of functionality. And in this document, we've tried to introduce the 7 principles of resilience, which is reflective, robust, redundant, flexible, resourceful, inclusive, and integrated, into the SUMP concept. So why is this guidance relevant for cities? This topic guide helps cities sustain urban life during crisis and to reduce the vulnerability of their transportation system. It helps cities that already have a SUMP to introduce a resilience focus, but it also helps cities that already have a resilience management strategy to integrate mobility planning. Overall, it prepares cities and regions better for disruptive realities. In this topic guide, we have reworked the classic SUMP cycle to introduce resilience focus points. So that differs a bit from the original SUMP. cycle. And one of those are, for example, including resilience leadership, having an emphasis on data collection and disaggregation of data, so distinctions between genders and age of groups to understand how mobility patterns can change depending on the data. And then a big part is on risk assessments and vulnerabilities to plan for crisis and emergencies, but also to think about possible scenario buildings. And another emphasis is also on short-term and long-term measures and assessing short-term measures for the long term. So rethinking emergency measures and pop-up cycling as an integral part of mobility planning. One of these examples in a more specific way is the assessment of risks, of weaknesses and strengths of a sustainable transportation system. So an up-to-date risk assessment can help cities to attract funding also and gather information that will improve their communication. But it's also an essential step to understand the risk and the vulnerabilities that a transport system is facing to be able to adapt more quickly in a crisis and understand the different challenges that a transportation system can face. Another part of this topic guide is about measure fields. So taking COVID-19 as a case study. So the second part of this guide builds on practices developed during the pandemic by cities around the world. And from various projects, this topic guide covers 9 measures, so cycling, walking, collective public transport, urban freight, urban vehicle access regulations, parking management, electromobility, and transport telematics. Taking COVID-19 as a case study on how to deal with the crisis, each measure sheet includes a presentation of the topic, of course, and its relationship to resilience in urban mobility. It also provides an overview of the field during COVID-19 crisis and immediate actions and long-term consideration to increase resilience based on those specific measures. Some of the short-term measures can be applied to deal with other types of crises. And different case studies were taken, 17 countries in total, mostly from Europe, but also from Latin America. And of course, a lot of Civitas projects were involved into this plan. So you can find all of these documents online on the LTIS platform, and I will also share a link with you in the chat. Thank you.
Morgane, ja se zahvaljujem jako puno vama i Rupprecht Consultu. Morgane će morati ići nakon ove prezentacije, ali s obzirom da CIVINET mreža ima vrlo dobru suradnju sa Rupprecht Consultom, bilo kakva pitanja dodatna ili pomoć, ako trebate od Rupprecht Consulta, uvijek se možete javiti. Hvala im na ovom još jednom od tematskih vodiča, a vjerujem da i ostale vodiče, ne samo ovaj COVID Practitioners, možete pronaći ili na LTIS portalu ili na Rupprecht stranici, a isto tako i mi radimo neke prijevode na stranici CIVINET mreže Slovenija Hrvatska. Morgane, hvala puno još jednom. Ne vidim trenutno pitanja za vas, tako da možda da sada još dam vremena ako netko želi nešto pitati. Ako ne, onda bih se prebacio na ova pitanja koja su prethodno, vidim u chatu, postavljena za profesora Cvitkovića. Što se tiče vozila u Hrvatskoj i što se tiče zašto pop-up biciklističke infrastrukture u Hrvatskoj ili regiji zapravo nije bilo u pandemiji kao odgovor.
Ovak, mislim da sam na ovo što se tiče količine prometa smanjenja mobilnosti odgovornio. Što se tiče pop-up biciklističkih staza, naime, vi u Republici Hrvatskoj da bi izvršili neku promjenu na kolniku, cesti, gradu, znači biciklistički promet uređuju jedinice lokalne regionalne samouprave uz suglasnost MUP-a. Znači da bi i napravili takvu neku stazu, trebali bi napraviti neko, ajmo reći, prometni elaborat, neko rješenje. Nakon toga trebate dobiti suglasnost MUP-a. Poslije toga treba to jedinice neke lokalne samouprave naručiti, a teško da će naručiti neko koji je gradonačelnik ili u općini ko nije izašao iz Republike Hrvatske, pa kad mu spomeneš pop-up biciklističku stazu, kod nas ja sam radio u gradskoj upravi, tako da znam, farbaj metar, povuci crtu i to je to. Da narod vidi da se nešto radi.
Znači, rekli bi da je zapravo problem u birokratizaciji cijelog procesa, odnosno usporavanju procesa izgradnje infrastrukture.
Da, jer kad, na primjer, dođete u Ministarstvo unutarnjih poslova, ako nečega nema u pravilniku o signalizaciji ili u zakonu o cestama, kao što su, ne znam, neka mjere za smirenja prometa koje se nalaze svud po Europi, a u našem pravilniku ga nema, vi to ne možete provesti. Znači ne možete dobiti suglasnost. Sad smo se susreli s tim, jer smo imali jedan projekt sa Švicarcima, htjeli smo uvesti neka cik-cak parkiranja, neke mjere njihove za smirenje prometa, međutim napravili smo čak elaborate, došli u policiju i rekli su ne. Nitko ne želi potpisati ono čega nema u zakonu i u nekim pravilnicima. Nažalost.
Super, mislim ovaj odgovor, odnosno pitanje je zapravo sjajan uvod za iduću prezentaciju. Iduću prezentaciju će imati Aleksander Buczynski iz Europske biciklističke federacije, gdje će zapravo dati pregled konkretnih mjera u biciklističkoj infrastrukturi diljem Europe kao odgovor na COVID pandemiju. Tako da vjerujem da nam može poslužiti kao inspiracija definitivno ova prezentacija i mjere. Aleksander, izvoli.
Thank you, Marko. Thank you for inviting me here, and good morning, everyone. You have seen the numbers already in the first presentation about the 2,000 kilometers of cycling measures announced across the Europe, and more than half of them already implemented. What I would like to show in my presentation is first to start with some explanation about different motivations that different cities, different regions had to really sign up for bicycle to introduce those cycling measures. Then I would like to show some concrete implementations from Brussels, where we are based and where I have some user experience also with the measures. Of course, there will be a moment also for a wider picture, what's happening across Europe, and how this is moving from temporary pop-up cycle lanes to more systematic large-scale recovery, also increasing the role of cycling. But first, about the motivations. You have heard already in presentations that the public transport is not so popular in the past year. The occupancy in public transport is lower either because of governmental restrictions or because of people losing trust or being afraid of infections. This also means lower income from tickets and financial problems for public transport companies. And cycling is, on the other hand, space efficient and cost efficient. So it doesn't cost much the city to provide conditions for cycling, both if you compare it with public transport, if you compare it with private cars. So many cities were introducing this kind of cycling measures to catch the people escaping from public transport and to make them to encourage them to cycle and not to take private cars, which would result in traffic jams and not loss of mobility in the city overall. The other big group of motivations is health reasons. The regular physical activity is critical for health, both physical and mental health. Even in the most strict lockdowns across Europe, going out for some exercise was allowed. So this was recognized as an essential activity. It's even more important during the COVID pandemic because it helps to alleviate some of the coexisting conditions that increase the severity or risk of death during COVID infection. But on the other hand, cities recognize that there is a shortage of areas for recreation, especially if you don't want people to move far away, go 20 kilometers for recreation. You want them to stay around their local area. You need to create this kind of places. On the third side, in the first lockdown, the traffic decreased a lot, which resulted in lower air pollution and lower noise. And quite a lot of people liked that they can now hear something else than traffic on their street. So they put some pressure on the cities to not go back to the old normal. And the third big group of motivations is about economy. The many different shops, shopping streets, markets, they had to introduce some limits on the number of people inside, which necessitated also organizing some place for waiting outside or even outdoor shopping. And to create this place in dense urban environment, you have to take some space from cars, either parking spaces or some traffic lanes. This was also important for gastronomy to create more space in outdoor cafes, terraces, so you can serve the clients in more safe environment. The risk of infection outdoor is much lower than enclosed inside the building. And finally, tourism, also psychotourism, turned out to be quite safe form of tourism and recreational activity. So moving on to Brussels, in total, in the past year, there were some changes introduced in traffic organization because of COVID only, not including the earlier plans, on around 100 kilometers of streets. And it started basically on the day of when the lockdown was introduced. So on the 18th of March last year, the national government announced that we're closing down the whole Belgium. And on the same day, the mayor of Brussels decided to close, starting the next day, around 6 kilometers of roads crossing a big park in the south of the city, to create space for safe recreation, for safe outdoor activity for the people living in the densely populated area. Well, this turned out to be a huge success, so that there were thousands of people came and started to enjoy the streets that used to be busy roads carrying traffic from suburbs to the city center. And it was very quickly followed by a more comprehensive plan, which had two main components. One was to create cycling lanes, cycle routes connecting suburbs with the city center. And this was the responsibility of the region managing, the capital region of Brussels managing the main roads. And this aimed to connect some of the existing cycle lanes and cycle paths, or to enlarge them a bit, because the cycling infrastructure in Brussels was very far from perfect. And on the other hand, the region supported local municipalities, districts of Brussels in implementing traffic calming and reduction measures on local streets to create this space for recreation. And this is one of the first implementations, still in April. The main street connecting the European district in Brussels with the city center, really ugly street, just 4 lanes of traffic, no trees, nothing, But you can see that there used to be a cycle path, the red pavement on the right side, but was very narrow, and it squeezed cyclists and pedestrians into a very narrow space. So to not create this, not to create these dangerous situations, to squeeze out so much people in narrow space, one lane was taken from the traffic to move cyclists to the carriage, to the former carriage way. An interesting example is a pop-up cycle lane on a motorway coming into the city from the northeastern suburbs. This section has 2 kilometers length, and it's now the widest cycle path in Brussels. It is 10 meters wide. It's not used as much as it should be because it lacks a connection with the cycle highway that was built by the next region outside the borders of Brussels. So there's still a bit missing on the borders of the region. So also Belgium has to deal with some administrative problems and some solutions don't work as intended. Not all of the pop-up cycle lanes were separated by concrete barriers. There were also some softer implementations. This is one of the cycle lanes that was introduced as a part of the second package. In September, the Brussels Minister for Mobility announced additional measures to cover some streets that were not covered by the first package. And this particular one was provided directly above a metro line to reduce the pressure on public transport and to provide also an alternative. In parallel, there were the activities undertaken by districts, and many of them were also about enlarging space for recreation. So, for example, closing some streets, crossing parks. But not always it was possible to just close the street completely. So the many measures were applying the principle of filtered permeability. So to reduce the traffic on a street next to an attractive recreational area, there were some obstacles built or some barriers provided across the street. So the street is still possible to drive to any house or any shop along the street, but the through traffic across the street is completely eliminated. Then the street is signed as a home zone, so pedestrians have priority on the street, and the volume of traffic is greatly reduced. You can see here a series of streets along the lakes in Excel, in one of the districts, that were turned into such a recreational boulevard, but also a cycle route, the regional cycle route following small streets with low traffic. And on the bottom, in the bottom right corner, you can see the characteristic corona flower pots, which were used all across the Brussels for such traffic calming measures. Sometimes for filtered permeability, sometimes for more traditional traffic calming to only reduce the speed of cars, and sometimes for also providing space for gastronomy, so for outdoor seating, and also closing short sections of streets for traffic. In summer 2020, several districts introduced the concept of play streets, so also making it only possible to access the streets by inhabitants of the streets and to provide space for kids to exercise or to play outside. And this will be also repeated this summer. What results did it brought? The comparisons are, of course, different because of all the changing restrictions and the big role of home office during the last year. But overall, when the data from the counters were compared, in 2020, the cycle traffic grew by 64%. At the same time, the car traffic decreased by 20%, and well, public transport, it's not much different than other cities. The number of people using public transport dropped by 40%. But I think this is some kind of success, because the people who left public transport didn't go to cars. For in comparison, in my home city, in Warsaw, there was very limited interventions to address this problem, and the public transport also decreased by 40%, but the car traffic didn't decrease and the cycle traffic didn't increase. So you can see that there is risk that after the restrictions end, then the city will be clogged with traffic. This was also analyzed on larger scale across Europe, and this study was mentioned already, which slightly different with a slightly different graph. But basically, what the researchers did here, they cross-referenced the data about infrastructure from our dashboard with the data from automatic traffic counters across Europe. And it seems that where the cities put in some provisional infrastructure for cyclists, the cycling increased by 10 to 50% more than in cities that did not do anything. There were also a lot of other measures accompanying, so not only infrastructure, but also, for example, subsidies for bicycle purchase and repair. In particular, subsidies for e-bikes and cargo bikes, because this is the measure that can convince new target groups. So also people who live a bit further away, people who have need to drive their kids to preschool, people who do heavy shopping, and so on, people who live in a bit more hilly cities, and so on and so on. Maybe a bit one more slide about tourism. Tourism was generally, very hard hit by the pandemic overall, but the cyclotourism seems to be quite resilient to the changes. And again, in 2020, most of regions that had developed cycling infrastructure for cyclotourism noted an increase in cycle traffic. What's after the pandemic? The legislative problems were already mentioned in one of the answers to the questions. And I think Italy is an interesting example, because one of the things that was done as a part of the COVID emergency COVID legislation was to make it easier and more flexible to introduce different forms of cycling infrastructure. So the definitions for example, for advanced stop lanes, cycle streets, school streets, were either introduced to the Italian legislation, or they were the restrictions that the conditions that you have to meet to apply this kind of measures were made more flexible. In terms of financing the hard infrastructure, you probably also have heard about the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the big EU funding instrument for the world after COVID. In total, it's nearly 700 billion euro available, and 37% of that needs to go for climate objectives. And cycling infrastructure is considered as 100% meeting this objective. So it's an attractive target of financing. And this was very much also stressed in the different communication of the from the European Commission that this is the kind of investments we want to see through the Recovery and Resilience Facility. The countries have to put up national plans of how they want to spend the money. And in terms of financing cycling, Belgium is a very clear front runner right now, with nearly 500 million euro allocated to cycling. Plus, there is co-funding at lower level from regional or local authorities for this for the investments that are in the plan. And most of it is for cycle highways, for high quality connections connecting Brussels with the suburbs or other big cities with the suburbs around them. But it's not only Belgium. There are also some interesting examples, for example, from Slovakia, which reserved 100 million for urban cycle tracks, and Romania, which reserved similar amount, but for touristic, for developing the infrastructure for cycle tourism. The deadline for submitting these national plans is approaching fast, so it's still 2 weeks' time to submit the final versions. We hope that there will be some more countries that have significant cycling investments in the plans, because this is a way to really kickstart the cycling infrastructure in countries that start from low level. Another source of financing is the regional funds for cycling investments. It used to be 700 million euro in the EU budget around 10 years ago. Then in the next multi-annual financial framework, it was 2 billion euro. And the MFF, the multi-annual financial framework that is starting now, it's not finalized yet. We are hoping, as the European Cyclist Federation, to reach 6 billion euro financing for cycling infrastructure. But of course, it depends also on cities, on regions to put together projects, and on countries to allow financing cycling infrastructure in their partnership agreements with the Commission to make it happen. So these are the links with for our dashboard of the COVID cycling measures and for the EU funds for cycling. I will also maybe put them in the chat because it's easier to click than to type from the presentation.
Aleksandar, hvala puno. Ovo je bilo dosta opsežno i jako puno informacija. Možda samo da navedem i za ostale da je ECF-ov vodič za financiranje i za plan oporavka preveden na naše jezike, tako da ga možete vidjeti dostupnog i na ECF-ovim stranicama, ali i na stranicama Udruge Sindikat biciklista. Ja bih se pozvao ljude da se uključe sa pitanjima ako ih ima za Aleksandra, zato što je ovo stvarno dosta dobrih primjera. Vjerujem da Aleksandar nam može i dati odgovore na pitanja poput zašto u Hrvatskoj ili u regiji nije bilo ovakvih primjera pop-up infrastrukture kao što je bilo u nekim državama. Aleksandar, možda ja mogu započeti sa pitanjem koja je točno procedura bila, evo, na primjer u Briselu sa postavljanjem pop-up infrastrukture, odnosno zašto mislite da je bilo puno lakše izgraditi ili odvojiti, prenamijeniti prostor za biciklističku infrastrukturu? Čuli ste vjerojatno i za ove primjere iz Hrvatske gdje je to potpuno birokratizirano i usporeno.
I don't have a good answer about Croatia. I haven't been to Croatia quite a long time, I think nearly well, 15 years now, so I don't know much about the Croatian situation, but the impression I had when comparing the results of different cities was that the cities that have done a lot for in terms of COVID-19 measures were the cities that were already prepared, that they already had some documentation planning ready, and the pandemic was an occasion to speed up the existing plans. So maybe that some actions that were already in the plans, but the politicians were afraid to make a decision, it helped them to make this decision. But on the other hand, we have examples of countries like Romania, which didn't do much during the pandemic itself, but they jumped on the opportunity given by the funding. So it was also an motivation to think about more long-term development. What I can also say about Brussels, it's not that it went without any problems. You should not have this image that everything is happening with everyone understands, everyone likes this. There were also protests against cycle lanes. There were legal challenges. So there were groups that sued the introduced measures, and some of the lawsuits were successful. So the city had to adjust. So, but the thing is that they tried to, and if something didn't work out, they tried a different way of introducing or changing the street. I heard that similar problems also happened in Germany, which has a very strict regulations, and some of the pop-up cycle lanes were challenged, but then the cities found a different way to address this problem.
Super, hvala na odgovoru. Još ćemo zapravo nastaviti razgovarati o biciklističkoj infrastrukturi kao odgovoru na pandemiju u planiranju prometa kroz panel. No prije panela i pauze imamo još jednu prezentaciju od strane gospodina Ekésa, odnosno CIVINET mreže Mađarska, koji će nam predstaviti što se u mađarskim gradovima dogodilo kao dobrom primjeru iz susjedne države. András, izvoli.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for the invitation. My name is András Ekés. I'm the managing director of Mobilissimus, and also as Mobilissimus, we are the secretariat of the Hungarian CIVINET called Magyar CIVINET. I'm sharing my screen. I hope you can see it. So we are a Budapest-based planning and consultancy company committed absolutely to the smart and eco-friendly solutions, working in local and international context. As mentioned, we are the secretariat of the Magyar CIVINET. We developed several SAMs as Mobilissimus, so we are also participating since the beginning in the development of the international and local methodology, how to develop and how to improve these documents. We are also doing a lot of network and service planning for Hungarian cities, but also abroad, and connected to all of our works. The awareness raising is a very important factor we try to consider every time. What happened when the pandemic arrived? The Hungarian model and consequences were quite similar to many European countries. So a very quick need for adaptation was required from the companies, from authorities, because quickly changing model split appeared, and less and less public transport users were on the public transport services. Now it's quite fluctuating depending on the different waves. And there is a much higher car use, unfortunately, and a much higher bike use, fortunately. But as a consequence, the public transport revenues dropped dramatically, and financial stability of the municipalities is quite uncertain. So we don't know, both from practical, professional and financial perspectives, how will be the new normal for our mobility perspective. So we need new approaches and new solutions. I will explain you quite briefly some solutions, what we consider both from program and from project side, we could contribute to a better mobility situation under pandemic. On the one hand, as Secretariat of the Magyar CIVINET, we organized several virtual events since the 8th of April 2020, quickly reacting to the cities and to our partners' needs by exchanging experiences and to show the learning by doing process, how both in Hungary and in different countries, operators and authorities and cities are behaving toward the public transport. And we organized several events, you can see, or I considered it was a very good idea to attract very, very quickly our partners for changing experiences. You can see the dates, and some of the events were organized around the public transport issues, but also on the workplace mobility, cycling and micro-mobility, and also on the pedestrianization of the cities. What about the pop-up solutions? We have the most examples from the city of Budapest, but not Budapest was the only city in Hungary doing pop-up infrastructure or cyclist lanes. In Budapest, there were around 10 to 15 new or temporary cyclist lanes to be developed during the spring or early summer period of 2020. That means that, for example, this picture and the next one are to be taken in the Grand Boulevard, where we have the the biggest, heaviest tramway traffic in Europe. And there were 2 times 2 lanes beforehand with a parking lane, and 1 lane was taken away from the cars and given to the cyclists. It was a huge political compromise with several protests against it, but due to the decreased traffic, it was absolutely a positive solution. So during the last summer period, I would say almost everyone accepted this new situation. Unfortunately, it was not really consequent how to solve the parking problems, how to make a better control on respecting the rules. So many illegal parkings and temporary loadings and unloadings were performed on these lanes. And before last September, unfortunately, there was a newer compromise to give back partially 1 lane on this big boulevard area on the southern part of it, and this pop-up cycle lane was partly put on the sidewalks, which I absolutely disagree. And this is still the situation, but still it's a basic infrastructural part and the part of the core cyclist network. So still this actual solution, it's quite important. You can use quite safely your bike on this itinerary. There were some new elements, new cyclist lanes on main streets as a part of the core network, which are not temporary, but were finalized. And I consider that it was a quite big solution, partly offered by the Hungarian Cyclist Club. They consulted a lot the municipality of Budapest. And these 2 pictures were taken on a street which has a metro and underground traffic on this street, under this street, but due to the reconstruction, there is a replacement, a bus replacement, but still a temporary cyclist lane was created during the summer period only, but because the higher traffic and the absolute need for priority for the buses, this was suspended since last September. Not only pop-up cyclist lane, but also some temporary closing or opening, depends on the point of view, were performed. These are the Danube banks on the Pest side, which has a quite heavy car traffic, and it was open for the pedestrians, cyclists, runners, so for every citizens for the weekends since I think April 2020 until late October 2020, and it has been restarted since the end of March, but for the time being only for weekends, and people are very happy to use it, and I think it's a very popular and absolutely cheap solution to attract people and to make a lower density of people searching for parks, because these parks and some recreation areas are really overloaded. And if you look at the Hungarian numbers, it's absolutely bad situation for 1.5 or 2 months, and people need to be accommodated in several new public areas. There was a similar action at the Tisza banks in the city of Szeged. It was organized for several weekends, and I think it will be repeated this year. And what were the impacts? You can see how the figures of the cyclists were growing last year, and the trend will be quite similar this year. This is a data set of one counter, but here you can see the data from accumulated data from 5 counters in Budapest. So you can see the gray part, how it was growing since 2019, despite the fact that many people were staying home or working from home in home office, and the mobility was completely decreasing if we consider the public transport, also the car traffic, the last spring period. So it was an absolutely a success story, but was sometimes a result of very strong political compromises and not completely good compromise, I would say. In some of the inner districts of Budapest, there are traffic calming pilots. This is from the one very important part of the city center between the 2 boulevards, and they changed several times the way of the one-way streets in order to create less traffic bounded areas and blocks, and it's more favorable for pedestrians and cyclists, but also there were many complaints because of the worse conditions for parking and sometimes worse conditions for cyclists, where cyclists faced counterweight traffic, car traffic on streets where it was forbidden before. So these are temporary projects, and these traffic calming pilots are revised and will be improved for this summer. We have in Budapest a public bike so-called Bubi system, and very quickly reacting to the pandemic, BKK, so the Center for Budapest Transport, reorganized how to use and how to register to the use of this Bubi system. So it was absolutely decreased the monthly subscription fee, and you could register online, which wasn't the case before, unfortunately. But now the BUBI is suspended because BKK is changing the bike, so it will appear in a couple of weeks. And but the system will remain like that, and the use of BUBI after several years were increasing after the beginning of the pandemic. What is a government-led decision, and it's absolutely not a positive issue. It's like a political candidate to make the parking for free in the whole country. And it was during the first wave, like in several countries and cities, but most of these cities and countries recognized very quickly that it's not a good decision, because it will attract a growing number of cars and more traffic jams and cars chasing free parking spaces, and it will make journeys less predictable, and it will give extra time spent for searching for parking spaces. And unfortunately, it is again the case. So since November 2020, we have a free parking in all city centers, and on the one hand, it gives more traffic in the city center, so it's not a positive measure. And on the other hand, it decreases a lot the municipal revenues, incomes, and it's a quite gray situation how to survive this period, and nobody knows what will be the length of this political candy measure. There is a strong communication from the part of the operators and authorities, like everywhere in Europe. You can see a face mask put on the tramway. We have also similar one for buses, and you can get quite impressive measures and videos and pictures how vehicles are disinfected and how to behave when you are taking the public transport. It's I think it was a very interesting story, because as we could also see during previous presentation, the decrease of trust towards the public transport services was quite important, and all authorities and companies were searching for convincing users that if you consider the rules and all others consider the rules, it's safe to use the public transport services. But we could see the statistic how these trends were dropping. And I will show you very briefly two projects we contributed to. The first one is a complete renewal of the bus service timetables and network and passenger information system in the city of Nyíregyháza, which is a city close to the Ukrainian border of 115,000 inhabitants. We've been selected as a planner for a new network when the pandemic arrived, and we convinced the city leadership and the professionals there to create a temporary bus network and schedule like a pandemic network, improving the direct connections, decreasing the number of necessary interchanges to avoid the interchanges and to create less contacts, and also to create new lines from the housing estate area through the city center and bus station to the big employers area, to the big factories. And it was very, very popular. And based on these new solutions, we could, which were introduced on the 1st of May last year, we could even improve this service level. And with 5% more capacities, the city opened the new public transport service on the 20th of August 2020. And it was very, very popular. we also got emails from the users giving thanks to the changes, and they were quite positive. And it was based on a strong public transport network and timetable modeling, and on a very strong passenger information system. So I think that this public transport system jumped around 30 years within 3 or 4 months. So it was a very good solution, and a unique similar solution in the Hungarian public transport model. So you can see how a timetable was before and how it is actually. So it's much more interval based. The lines are and the services are harmonized. The connections are much better among buses, among local and regional buses, and to the railways. And we contributed to a very strong communication, cooperating with the city and cooperating with the operator Volambus, which is a national operator, but also operates in the city of Nyíregyháza, the local services. There were brochures, and we particularly helped both the drivers and the complete team how to do such a big change in urban public transport. And the last example I would show, it's the solution, an on-demand solution to give better coverage in the public transport of Zalaegerszeg. It's a city of 60,000 inhabitants, quite close to the Slovenian border. And we participated in the Interreg project called Share Place, together with several other partners from Austria, from Croatia, from Italy. And we developed, based on a new bus network, we had the baseline scenarios, service ID called Zerge. Zerge means chamois, this hilly animal. And Zalaegerszeg, the city name, is sometimes abbreviated ZEG. So we invented this name Zerge for these bus lines. And the idea was to give a better coverage on hilly areas with narrow streets where people never got public transport services. And it was absolutely an idea before the pandemic, but we could implement twice 6 weeks of test periods in 2019 and in 2020, in the autumn period, absolutely in the middle of the second wave of the pandemic. We had 3 lines at the beginning and plus 1 line for the testing period last year, and using stop points instead of fixed stops. And it was a DRT, so demand responsive service. So people had to register and book to the given services in order to deal with the capacities and using the buses only when and where there are demands. We developed very good visual elements, which was quite different from the city transport used ones. So it was colorful, showing maps and quite good timetable structure. Also, we described what are the rules to call or to book via mobile or web-based to the given trips. And people were very satisfied. Both the drivers like these services, and actually it's suspended because it was financed by the EU project. But we really hope that from later this year, the service will be integrated to the urban public transport. And during the pandemic, it was a very good solution for those people who were quite separated from the public transport on these hilly areas, and they were quite satisfied with these services. And more people started to use the online registration and online booking, which shows that in such a hilly and quite remote area, it's absolutely a feasible solution to use the online platforms for such a service. And and I think that it could contribute to a better service under the pandemic. So I collected some quite different examples from the Hungarian cities. I hope you liked it, and I'm free to answer questions if you have. Thank you for your attention.
Hvala Andrušu još jednom, sjajni primjeri iz Mađarske. Drago mi je da se u jednoj od CIVINET mreža pokazuju ovako dobri primjeri. Biću samo kratak sa jednim pitanjem prije pauze, čisto da malo predahnemo. András, znači pitanje je koji je ekonomski aspekt ZRG sistema, da li je profitabilan ili je zapravo neprofitabilan sustav?
As the service was an additional service to the normal public transport, it had extra costs, and we had to do it for free for the passengers, as it was financed from an EU project, from this Interreg Central Europe project called Shared Place, but it was just for testing. And we have a statement that we could integrate in the future this service to the normal bus service, and we could do a balance when the city wouldn't have to pay more for the public transport services than it pays for now, and we could use these buses, smaller buses, for example, on other lines when the ZRG system doesn't require both buses, or there is I mean, early mornings, weekend times, late evenings, you can use these smaller buses instead of big or articulated buses. So I think that under these pandemic circumstances, when operators and cities have no a big financing option to operate, we could integrate without needing extra costs. But this calculation wasn't started yet, unfortunately, because the city is still pending whether to integrate or to wait some more time. That's why I cannot tell an exact yes or no answer.
Dobro, hvala puno. Imamo još par pitanja, András, pa ako nam se možete pridružiti dio na panelu. Ja bih sad stvarno malo napravio pauzu do nekih 12 i 2-3 minute, znači 10 minuta pauze. I zahvaliti se, nisam se sjetio prije zahvaliti našem prevoditelju Vaškim Fazliju. Hvala puno, vjerujem da je ovo dosta zahtjevno i da će vama ova pauza najviše goditi. Tako da vidimo se evo za 10 minuta u 12:04. Marko, Aljaž, Jelena, ako netko od vas ima mogućnost u panelu uključiti kameru, čisto da nas vide ljudi, to je bilo super. Znam da Jelena... Jelena je... imaš, super.
Da, priključena sam hibridno i preko mobilnog i na računaru.
Malo nam se odužilo s prezentacijama, iako to je i očekivano, pa zapravo ćemo probati pratiti zadani termin i završiti do 1. Vjerujem da ćemo moći. Pozdrav, Aljaž.
Bravo. Jesi me već zvao? Ne, ok.
Ne, samo da vidim da li možete upaliti mikrofone da dok krećemo za čas. Panel je zapravo vrlo fleksibilan, tako da ako se hoćete referirati na neke od prezentacija, a ne samo na odgovore na pitanja, slobodno i što više. Jer bilo je stvarno jako puno podataka, tako da vjerujem da imamo bazu za komentiranje. Aljaž, ti ćeš biti prvi. Tadej, are you back with us? Čujem. Može. Evo, čekamo još Tadeja i možemo kroz minutu, dvije započeti sa panelom. Oh, you're back, Tadej? Great.
Yep.
Great. Znači, sad ću se prebaciti na naše jezike. Prevoditelj je tu s nama, tako da Tadej slobodno na engleskom. Andraš isto tako. Imamo još jedno, odnosno dva pitanja prije same panelice za paneliste, pa bih volio započeti s time. Napravo dosta je pitanja ovdje, ali možda prva dva, András, jedno za tebe, a drugo za sve koji su prethodno prezentirali. András, da li u Mađarskoj postoji neka legislativa, znači zakoni koji određuju prijevoz na poziv? A drugo pitanje za sve paneliste, da li su neke studije izvedivosti napravljene prije izgradnje pop-up infrastrukture, to je možda pitanje za Aleksandra. Pa ako samo možete kratko prije nego evo počinjemo sa panelistima. András?
More or less, do you mean that is there any legislation on the on-demand public transport services? Yeah.
Na poziv.
Okay. So there is a legislation partly working on the on-demand public transport services in cities. You can do it as a part of a local public transport, but it's much less feasible in rural areas between different settlements because it's a national public transport service and it's more limited how you can do it. For example, as far as I remember, you cannot do it in P cars, but you can do it in off-P cars. Of course, it's not really feasible if you have a solution for P cars and a different solution for the off-P cars. It needs some improvement in the legislation, but for the city areas, you can actually do it.
Super. A drugo pitanje nam možda zapravo može Aleksander najbolje objasniti, a vezano je znači za...
I think it's a very broad question. It's there are thousands of studies on cycling infrastructure, on the impact on cycling numbers and economic impact and also health impact of cycling infrastructure. I can try to paste some links in the chat, but what is maybe special about the studies that were conducted now during the pandemic, that a lot of changes happened in a very short time. Normally, where you build a cycling infrastructure in the city, it happens over a longer time. It's the fastest, it's 3 years, and sometimes it's 20 years, and it's still not completed. So there are a lot of different factors that you need to consider. And now you had a group which introduced some measures very quickly, and a control group which did nothing. So it was very good for comparisons. Does this answer the question? Or
Da, hvala. Evo, kolege su se zahvalile na odgovoru. Ja bih zapravo počeo sa panelom, ali prvo da predstavim zapravo paneliste. Imamo profesora Slavulja sa Fakulteta prometnih znanosti Sveučilišta u Zagrebu ovdje s nama. Gospodin Plevnik iz Urbanističkog instituta Republike Slovenije je s nama. Jelena Nikolić iz Grada Kruševca iz Srbije i također Tadeja Brezinu sa Tehničkog sveučilišta u Beču ste imali prilike slušati i ranije. Ja bih počeo sa gospodinom Plevnikom. Pandemija nam je zapravo pokazala koliko brzo i efikasno možemo uvoditi promjene prenamjenom prostora u prometnoj infrastrukturi, a možda najčešća, isto tako i vidljivija i efikasnija mjera koja se u pandemiji usmjerila na poboljšanje prometnog sustava je bila pop-up biciklistička infrastruktura. Pa ako možete malo komentirati tu mjeru i zapravo mišljenje koliko mislite da će pop-up infrastruktura ostati trajna i nakon pandemije.
Hvala. Pa mislim da je pop-up biciklistička infrastruktura samo jedna od mjera. To smo vidjeli iz današnjih prezentacija, da je ipak zajednički nazivnik svih tih mjera ta transformacija cestovnog prostora. Znači pozitivnih mjera. Čuli smo dosta negativnih primjera kao u našim okruženjima, gašenje javnog prevoza ili besplatni parking. Ali kod pozitivnih mjera glavni zajednički nazivnik je ta transformacija, oduzimanje cestovnog prostora automobilima, je njegova transformacija u prostor za alternative, u pješačke zone, u biciklističke staze i tako dalje. I tu bi se pridružio prezentaciji Aleksandra ili odgovor Aleksandra koji je odgovorio da su u te pop-up mjere ušli gradovi koji su bili već pre pandemije spremni na to. To su gradovi koji su imali neku vrstu strategije, bilo to SAMP ili neki drugi oblik, a više od toga gradovi koji su imali raščišćene prioritete i koji su iskoristili to vanredno stanje sa već jasnom slikom šta žele da urade u sljedećim godinama, samo da su sad imali mogućnost i prostor i podršku da su se te stvari dogodile brže. Tako da možda samo primjedba da u našem regionu do toga nije došlo, to je bilo isto jedno pitanje prije. Ja mislim da iako imamo veliki broj sumpova u našem regionu, ti sumpovi možda još nisu sazreli do stepena gdje se implementuju prave ili te efikasne mjere u smislu održive mobilnosti, tako da i to je dosta jak pokazatelj šta se dešava u našim gradovima. Eto toliko. Još na kraju je bilo pitanje da li će ostati. Pa vezano na tu prvu interpretaciju da su u te mjere ušli gradovi koji su bili za to spremni i koji su to već planirali, ja ću biti za veliki dio tih mjera optimističan i prognozirati da će u velikoj mjeri dosta tih mjera ostati. Toliko.
Hvala, Aljaž. Če bi možda pozvao profesora Slavulja da nam komentira upravo taj izostanak mjera u našoj regiji, jer čak i pri planiranju ovog događanja sam zapravo radio jedno osobno istraživanje u kojem sam promatrao što su gradovi u CIVINET mreži Slovenija, Hrvatska i Istočna Europa učinili i tu nije bilo puno primjera, pa možda da malo s jedne strane komentirate to, a drugo što vi mislite da su izgledni scenariji u prometnom planiranju u našoj regiji, ali u vrlo kratkoj budućnosti.
Pa evo, ja ne znam kakva je bila generalna situacija s lockdownom, mislim kod nas još bili su i ti potresi, tako da sve to malo usporilo tu situaciju. Evo, mislim da je i ovaj kolega Cvitić, što je već prethodno govorio, rekao da nemamo mi nekakvih primjera, ne znam da li smo svi zaspali bili ili nas je korona uplašila toliko da se nije ništa provodilo. Ono što sam ja čuo osobno, da su neki taksisti vozili zaposlenike KB Dubrava besplatno, to je evo, možda što sam ja ovako svojim nekakvim privatnim istraživanjem uspio saznati. Načelno još da su neki hoteli nudili isto besplatan smještaj, ali dobro, to sad nema veze toliko s prometom, isto djelatnicima pojedinih bolnica koji su bili zaslužni koji su podnijeli taj teret. Što se tiče još pitanja kako vidimo izgledne scenarije u budućnosti u kratkoročnoj, mislim da mi samo počnemo primjenjivati ovo što smo vidjeli, već bi daleko otišli. Znači vidjeli smo tu brojne primjere što se može, kako se može. Sad dolazimo do te zakonske osnove, isto što je bila napomenuta. Morate imati elaborate određene, morate naći nekakva sredstva, što vidjeli smo u ovim isto od Europske biciklističke udruge, sredstva definitivno se povećavaju za biciklistički promet. S druge strane vidjeli smo da nekakva rješenja koja su lako provediva, praktički ne treba nešto previše financijskih sredstava, tako da mislim da, kažem, da samo počnemo provoditi to što se vani radi bi bilo dobro.
Super, i ne znam možda jel hoćete komentirati zapravo, jer na primjer u Zagrebu nije bila, dobro ste i rekli, nije bila samo utjecaj pandemije, nego utjecaj potresa koji nam je upravo trebao i ubrzati neke mjere, pogotovo u nemotoriziranom prometu, zapravo je djelovao suprotno.
Da, što se tiče Zagreba, naravno, uvijek se to gleda i situacija prije ove pandemije i prije potresa. Počele su se dešavati neke promjene u shared prostorima, u centru grada su se počele dijeliti nekakvi prostori. Brzine su, kako smo vidjeli, dosta prezentacija oko tih brzina. Na zelenim valovima je dalje 50 na sat. Naravno da postoji puno mogućnosti sa redizajnom prostora, odmicanja tih parkirnih mjesta okolo i pretvaranja u nekakve biciklističke staze i trake, tako da s te strane mislim da u budućnosti kad se riješi ova situacija i potres je praktički jedna prilika da se nešto radi na tome. Znači vidjeli smo prije isto su bile u sklopu Europskog tjedna mobilnosti inicijative za proširenje pješačke zone, tako da mislim na tome treba sigurno raditi dalje.
Hvala. Gospođo Nikolić, nismo ovdje imali primjere iz Srbije, pa zapravo iz vašeg ugla kako vi gledate na utjecaj pandemije na promet u Srbiji? Imali kakvih mjera koje su proveli gradovi? Ako ne, gdje su možda najveće prilike propuštene, u kojim gradovima i na koji način, ako nam malo možete?
Hvala na pitanju. Ja bih se nadovezala na već prethodne paneliste i prezentere. Znači, sličan je slučaj u Srbiji bio koji se tiče javnog prevoza. Znači, da je na početku pandemije javni prevoz bio ukinut, a da je parkiranje bilo besplatno. Kasnije se ovo javni prevoz vratio u upotrebu i naravno zbog ove mere su više bile pogođeni oni koji žive u ruralnom području nego u gradskom području. Kao što vam je poznato, većina naših gradova spada u gradove male i srednje veličine, izuzev Beograda, te možemo da kažemo da ovi manji gradovi spadaju u koncept 15-minutnog grada, te su žitelji mogli da zadovolje svoje potrebe i pešice i biciklom i tako dalje, znači za razliku od onih koji žive na seoskom području. Što se tiče komentara za pop-up biciklističke staze, ono što je već Ivan napomenuo, procedura kako se ova infrastruktura primenjuje, znači trebalo bi pre svega pripremiti projektnu dokumentaciju, zatim opredeliti sredstva, znači naći izvođača. Zato to sve negde ima i nekih drugih ograničenja ukoliko to nije nadležnost lokalne samouprave, odnosno pripada državnom putu. Još jedna stvar je u pitanju, znači u zavisnosti od veličine lokalne samouprave, da li ima preduzeće kome je povereno da radi projektantske usluge ili izvođenje na licu mesta ili mora da bude javni tender za ove usluge. I sad naravno da li su bila predviđena budžetska sredstva ili treba raditi izmenu budžeta. Još jedna vrlo važna stvar, vidjeli smo primjere iz Evrope i gde su uglavnom prikazane saobraćajnice koje su šire. Naši gradovi uglavnom imaju, da kažemo, tu užu urbanu matricu i da ukoliko bismo primenjivali biciklističke trake možda nema dovoljno prostora ukoliko bi bio, na primjer, dvosmeran automobilski saobraćaj, već se ulica mora transformisati u jednosmernu. Postojale su inicijative da se možda primene biciklističke trake u kontrasmeru u jednosmernoj ulici, međutim tu postoje i zakonska ograničenja, naime još uvek ta biciklistička traka u kontrasmeru, biciklistička ulica nije zakonom regulisana, mada ima primjera u nekim gradovima. Te ono što je Ivan napomenuo, znači može da se, na primjer, javi sutradan problem ukoliko dođe do saobraćajne nezgode, ta mera je primenjena, ali nije zakonski regulisana, onda je pitanje odgovornosti, krivice, osiguranja i tako dalje, te možda tu negde postoji bojazan primene takvih mera. Pored toga, znači, treba takođe napomenuti i nedostatak regulative dimenzionisanja same biciklističke infrastrukture, odnosno najčešće što rade naši planeri i projektanti da opredeljuju minimalne površine. Tu se onda postavlja pitanje da li se osjećate dovoljno bezbedno da vozite bicikl u traci širine 70 cm. Postoje neka istraživanja iz Holandije, gde kažu da je neka minimalna širina od 1,5 m, 1,70 m, gde se vi osjećate prijatno i bezbedno da koristite takvu infrastrukturu. I naravno, obično se ta površina u našem slučaju opredeljuje da bude, da kažemo, uz ivičnjak, a tu su obično i slivnici i šahte i samim tim je opet pitanje voljnosti korišćenja takve infrastrukture. Ono što možemo da kažemo da je ova pandemija, kažem, izuzev toga što nismo imali te pop-up biciklističke staze, ali je primetan povećan broj biciklista i samim tim i tražnje za kupovinom bicikla. Ono što imamo kao lep primer iz grada Novog Sada, gde su pokrenuli inicijativu koja bi trebalo se realizuje ove godine, a to je subvencija za kupovinu bicikla za građane. Ja se nadam u nekom narednom periodu da će to da bude realizovano pa da vidimo iskustva i naravno grad Niš je krenuo da prati, da kažemo, ovu inicijativu Novog Sada. Takođe, ono što možemo da kažemo da pandemija jeste uticala, to je na korišćenje informativnih tehnologija i digitalizacije. Ono što recimo u prethodnim godinama nismo imali kao čestu mogućnost u javnom i privatnom sektoru, to je rad od kuće. Znači, to možemo da vidimo, to su negde i posebno prihvatile, da kažem, osobe sa invaliditetom, gde kažu da evo u ovom slučaju kada nije potrebno fizički biti prisutan u nekoj zgradi, samim tim neka radna mesta mogu da budu prilagodljivija za zapošljavanje osoba sa invaliditetom. Znači, ne samo da je to bilo moguće u javnom sektoru, što ranije nije bilo, zatim pod škola prilikom online nastave, to je bilo i u nekim privatnim preduzećima, naravno ukoliko to priroda posla dozvoljava. Ono što je isto, da kažemo, dozvoljeno, da kažemo u prethodnih par godina je, na primjer, procedura izdavanja građevinskih dozvola potpuno na elektronski način. Ova pandemija je uticala da se još neke usluge omoguće putem portala e-uprave, znači moguće je, na primjer, prijaviti decu za školu, vrtić, potpuno elektronski bez fizičkog dolaska i predaje dokumentacije. I da kažemo, eto, još jedna stvar, znači s obzirom da su i prodavnice i uslužne delatnosti bile zatvorene, može se primetiti povećan procenat kupovine preko interneta, a samim tim i kasnije dostave, odnosno pojavljivanja raznih i aplikacija i novih kompanija za dostavu robe i to ne samo, znači, dostava putem motornih vozila, nego i korišćenje kargo bicikala u ovu svrhu. Tako da kažem, eto, pojave tih novih usluga. I naravno ono što možemo da napomenemo, to je da sigurno je uticalo na povećanje svesti o zdravlju i značaju čistog vazduha, tako da se nadam da će neke naredne mere, da kažemo, ići i u ovom smeru.
Hvala, Jelena. Ja bih samo podsjetio sve sudionike da ukoliko imate pitanje ili se želite uključiti u diskusiju, možete ili u chatu ili dizanjem ruke pa ćemo vas uključiti. Profesor Tadej, dosta smo čuli od vas kroz istraživanje o promjeni navika u prometovanju. Što mislite da su neki scenariji koje možemo očekivati sada u budućnosti, ne sad samo prometnih navika, nego i o planiranju prometa? Da li mislite da će javni prijevoz se vratiti na razine vrlo brzo? Znači, široko neko pitanje i isto tako, naravno, u kontekstu nekih klimatskih ciljeva Europske unije do 2030. i 2050.
Well, if you're naming the example of public transport, I'm pretty much afraid that it is not going to be returned quickly to that level. For the case of Vienna, which is sometimes considered as the sometimes former capital of world capital of public transport, even from the tramway perspective, the experience is that the levels have fallen down to somewhere 60% of the levels before the pandemic. Even within the months, which was late summer, early fall, where basically behavior was kind of normal once again, we had very, very low levels. or much lower levels than was expected before. If you're asking me what are the likely scenarios, I'm not very sure, because of course predicting the future is always difficult. But I would like to point to two things. We've seen in these presentations today very nice examples, very illustrious examples, and very imaginative examples how people cope, or how public administrations cope with the present danger, the new situations, in a very quick manner. But what is, from my point of view, defining the change of transport policy is not how quickly can we adapt to a clear and imminent danger which is available and perceivable by everybody right now, like the danger of death or getting ill due to a pandemic, but this kind of very far away detached danger of the climate change, which we are not sure, or a lot of the people are not sure what kind of implications that might have. And what I think what we've learned from the pandemic so far is that at least two things: that mobility behavior can change pretty quickly if it is actually necessary, but we've also learned that we go back to normal as we had before also very quickly. So as long as there's no change in the forces that are shaping mobility, there's like the settlement structure or the planning documentation or the planning regulations, as Jelena said before, as there is a lack sometimes or quite often of the lack of regulation, not a lot of things have changed. Of course, we have a highlight on that, but basically the underlying procedures, the underlying regulations, they're mostly or very often pretty much the same as they have been before the pandemic. So I think it is going to be, now we have seen the examples of how infrastructure can be pretty quickly rearranged or reused or changed basically in its use. But what we have not learned yet so far is how the regulations can be adapted in that way so that those temporal changes can become permanent one, because we do not need to forget that everything that has produced the problems, the transport-wise problems of before the pandemic, and by everything I mean the regulations, the people acting there, the interests acting there, they didn't change due to the pandemic. So it is going to be, I think, going to be a very big task to transform the learnings of this intermediate timescale changes into changed regulations. Because if the regulations don't change, and for example, also the education of engineers, planners, I don't see that much of an improvement that would be necessary or that is necessary to meet these demands for climate neutrality or strongly reduce climate emissions, which are posed for 2030 and 2050. So I think the key learning from the epidemic, from my point of view, would be that we need to get regulations changed so that it's not only a kind of exemplary exemption, but can become the regulation, the new normal.
Hvala. Aljaž, kad već pričamo o propisima, u Sloveniji, koliko sam čuo, je nova najava financiranja sumpova, odnosno druge generacije i financiranje implementacije sumpova. Da li mislite da će zapravo pandemija ubrzati donošenje implementaciju sumpova i mjera u državama, regijama i gradovima gdje to do sad nije bio slučaj? Pa isto tako, ako možete malo više za sve sudionike iz naše regije reći o procesima koji se trenutno dešavaju na nacionalnoj razini u Sloveniji.
Pa prvo pitanje, ja mislim da ne. Nadovezao bi se na moj prvi dio, kad sam rekao da promjene rade gradovi koji su bili već prije spremni i koji su imali sump na razini spreman za velike promjene. Mi trenutno radimo nove smjernice za sumpove u Sloveniji, nacionalne smjernice, i za te smjernice smo odradili par analiza. Jedna analiza je bila oko stanja i efikasnosti naših sumpova u zemlji, a druga analiza je bila da smo pogledali najuspješnije gradove u Europi koji su u prošlih 10-20 godina napravili najveći skok u model shiftu. Ta analiza pokazuje ili potvrđuje teoriju Petera Jonesa da svaki sump mora proći kroz različite faze razvoja i naša analiza naših sumpova pokazuje da su naši, pa mogu reći i u regionu, ne samo u Sloveniji, sumpovi u takozvanoj infantilnoj fazi. Znači, tek se spremaju neki uslovi, menja se mišljenje, menja se fokus planiranja, eksperti se educiraju u tom pravcu, a pravih promjena još nema. Možda su neke mjere male, izolovane, ali ne donose velike promjene u gradovima. A kad smo pogledali te gradove koji su u posljednjih 10 godina napravili veliki skok, znači od 10 ili više posto promjena u upotrebi održivih načina prijevoza, to su gradovi koji imaju već zreli sump, koji rade na to što sam prije rekao, transformaciji cestovnog prostora, znači ne bave se više povećanjem kapaciteta ili nivoa usluga automobila, nego taj prostor koji postoji mijenjaju i daju ga u upotrebu znači održivim načinom prijevoza. Tako da mislim da pandemija neće imati veliki utjecaj na te gradove koji su tek počeli da se bave tim područjem, iako im će dati neki dodatni poticaj ili dodatni faktor uspjeha za budućnost. A to što se dešava kod nas trenutno, jedna stvar je da ćemo kroz trenutno financiranje vjerovatno uspjeti sufinancirati novu generaciju sumpova u općinama koje to već imaju i možda neke nove. Trenutno imamo više od 80 gradova, što jedna trećina općina u Sloveniji ima sump, a to znači da su sve velike općine pokrivene, znači 75% građana u Sloveniji živi u općinama koji ima sump. Znači u sljedećih par godina očekujemo novu generaciju. Kroz te nove smjernice šaljemo informaciju da je sad vreme velikih promjena, da moraju mjere i ti sumpovi biti puno više ambiciozniji nego što su bili do sada. A u paralelu događa se puno stvari. Sprema se novi zakon o sumpu koji će vjerovatno omogućiti stabilno financiranje tog područja i masa nekih projekata radi u smjeri potpornih smjernica i dodatnih tih sadržaja u tom mozaiku održive mobilnosti. Evo, toliko na kratko.
Hvala, Aljaž. Evo, dobri primjeri iz Slovenije. Mogao bih zapravo komentirati da od svih CIVINET država od naše mreže je Slovenija najdalje otišla u primjeni sumpova gdje ima i nacionalnu podršku, pa nam vjerojatno možete poslužiti kao dobra inspiracija. Profesore Slavulj, sad dosta smo sad čuli nekih ne toliko ambicioznih i optimističnih mišljenja o scenarijima za budućnost. Pa u tom kontekstu i istraživanje isto tako koje radite kao Fakultet prometa u Zagrebu, često čujemo u Hrvatskoj i u regiji da se kao jednom velikom utjecaju priča o broju vozila, odnosno broju automobila na 1000 stanovnika. Kad se pak pogleda Eurostat, vidi se da nijedna od država bivše Jugoslavije i naše CIVINET mreže taj broj vozila nema veći od zemalja koje idealiziramo. To znači da pričamo o prometnim navikama i načinima kako upotrebljavamo taj automobil, pa možete li nam nešto komentirati o tim prometnim navikama u kontekstu pandemije i u kontekstu naše regije? Čujemo se. Marko, mikrofon vam je isključen.
Sad se čujemo.
Super.
Hvala. Ja ću samo iskoristiti prije nego što počnemo o broju osobnih automobila na 1000 stanovnika, komentirati samo reći da su u biti te udruge civilnog društva te koje praktički bi trebale potaknuti možda neke spavajuće gradske službe kako bi se pojedine mjere provele. Znači, naravno, što je i Jelena govorila, sve tu stvari zakonskog tog nekakvog okvira, ali ajmo i mijenjati zakone. Ako nam zakoni ne odgovaraju, ne trebamo se ograničavati sa nekakvim zakonskim rješenjima, nego to je isto danas svako malo idu ti zakoni o sigurnosti, o prijevozu u cestovnom prometu, idu nekakve izmjene, pa onda sigurno se može poraditi na nekakvim izmjenama koje bi bile zakonski legalne. Tako da s te strane smatram da su isto udruge jedan od bitnih faktora. A što se tiče samog broja stupnja motorizacije ili broja osobnih vozila na 1000 stanovnika, evo tu kad gledamo nekakav trend od 2008. do 2017. vidimo na prosjeku cijele Europske unije praktički povećanje. Znači nekakav prosjek je oko 500 za 2017. gdje što se tiče vaših pitanja, to je točno. Znači Hrvatska je tu, ako gledamo na nekakvih 389 u 2017. vozila, a recimo nekakva Nizozemska 487 ili Danska na 438. Sama promjena tih navika je u tome što, iako kad recimo promatramo Njemačku, znači imate tamo da praktički cijela obitelj, ako uzmemo jednu obitelj koja ima 2 odrasle djece punoljetne, znači njih 4 imaju osobna vozila, ali ipak u samom centru koriste dosta i javni prijevoz. Znači da sigurno su svjesni na što se tiče samog korištenja i koji su učinci na okoliš i na ostale negativne eksterne troškove koje proizrukuje osobno vozilo, tako da mislim da s te strane osobno vozilo treba koristiti kad je potrebno, a ne kad, znači imamo brojne te regulacije koje zabranjuju ulaske pa se koriste razni sharing sustavi, tako da s te strane uvijek se može nekako rješenje pronaći, naravno i uz to što sam spominjao i zakonsku osnovu. Tako da vidjeli smo iz brojnih prezentacija da ta kilometraža prosječna koja se radi je mala. Znači nju možete preći i pješice i biciklom, naravno treba voditi računa o osobama starijim ili učenicima koji nemaju mogućnost vozačke dozvole i koje ne mogu sama voziti, tako da neki oblik javnog prijevoza će uvijek biti potreban. To je ono što bih rekao. Evo, da ne dužim više, mislim da sigurno i treba raditi ne od osnovne škole, nego već i od vrtića na promjeni prometnih navika.
Hvala. Evo, kolegica Mirović sa Novosadskog tehničkog fakulteta nam se želi uključiti, možda se referirati na ono što je već Jelena vrlo opsežno i rekla za Srbiju. Izvolite.
Dobar dan svima i pre svega da se zahvalim koleginici Jeleni. Ja sad ovde u vezi pa iz prvih redova COVID-a. Prošle nedelje nisam bila ni sigurna na šta će to ispasti ove nedelje, tako da se zahvaljujem Jeleni na učešću u ovom panelu, ne manje više slušajući neke stvari, samo prosto bih htela malo da podvučem, da se uključim u tu priču i više onako neka pitanja koja mislim da pred nama tek stoje da iznesem, a nažalost nekih si svestan tek u onom momentu kad osetiš posledice svega. Mislim da nismo baš bili svesni svega ovoga, ni kako izaći na kraj. Nadovezat ću se samo na vašu ovu priču za stepen motorizacije imali ste, Marko, da li vi ili na Civitasu, nisam sigurna. Ja to često koristim studentima u prezentaciji, činjenicu da Cirih ima stepen motorizacije isti kao i Novi Sad. I često kao obrazloženje za to nudim, mislim da je više alternativa koja se nudi, a ne svest o potrebi za nečim. Znači, mislim da je, kad nudite nekom alternativu, onda on nema potrebu za nečim. Takođe, mislim da sam Marka zamolila, a on kaže nema vremena možda za neku buduću raspravu, da nekog lekara uključimo u priču, nekog ove potrebe, jer iskreno ja koja se bavim i sportom, izuzetno sam aktivna posle svega ovoga, narednih 2 meseca ja ne znam kako ću se vratiti baš na biciklu na onoliko koliko sam pre mogla. Tu postoji strah i neznanje i sve ostalo, znači pitanje koliko, da li tu ima nekih efekata na izbor kako i šta koristiti. Samo da napomenem još osim ECF-a u ITP stalno priča o tome kako se gube putnici u javnom prevozu. Mnogo toga možete pronaći kod njih, čak su im sad free webinari koje su do sad mnogo naplaćivali, tako da priključite se slobodno u njihovu priču. Kažu da je 70 do 80% putnika u javnom prevozu nestalo. Mislim da treba razmisliti o mnogo čemu, sjajni podaci Tadejevi, sjajni podaci koji nam govore mnogo što šta. Samo da pomenem da možda istraživanja treba usmeriti na drugu stranu u smislu gde su nam sad vršna opterećenja, kakva je sad mobilnost i pitanje da će se ljudi koji su sad online, Bill Gates prognozira da možda 30% će se vratiti da radi kako je nekad radilo. Tako da ima tu još dosta teme za razgovor i samo da pohvalim, stvarno mi je bilo značajno istraživanje koje je kolega Cvetković izneo na početku i recimo primere Tel Aviva i 15-minutnih pešačenja, znači možda ćemo ipak rešenja tražiti kod urbanista, možda nisu samo saobraćajci ti koji će rešavati problem, mislim da ključnu ulogu igraju urbanisti sa lociranjem sadržaja i nešto da napomenem da Tel Aviv, Izrael, već dugi niz godina imaju mogućnost da prate mobilne telefone i da dobijete podatak o tome. Mi u Evropi to nemamo, kolege su to, znači hoću da kažem, možda zakon i na tu stranu, koji bi nam neke stvari dozvolio, bi nam opet omogućio da nešto mnogo lakše planiramo i upravljamo sistemom, jer mislim da smo još uvek daleko od real-time sistema i pametnih tehnologija. Toliko, hvala svima i sve najbolje. I da kažem je ovo tako strašno, samo što treba vremena.
Hvala vam, Valentina. Evo slučajno imamo ovdje nekog ko se bavi i prometnom temom i upravo je doktorirao na temu zdravih gradova, pa ako želite mogu ga uključiti. To je predsjednik sindikata biciklista udruge koja se bavi problematikom biciklističkog prometa u Hrvatskoj, pa ako imate koje konkretno pitanje recite i evo ja mogu uključiti Janka.
Pa pitanje je koliko smo mi spremni da intenzivno i pešačimo i vozimo bicikl nakon svega ovoga. Moje konkretno, ovo je sad lično pitanje.
Evo meni, pošto mi se dala mogućnost mikrofona, mi je izašao iz programa i ponovno ušao, pa nisam sad čuo koje je točno bilo konkretno pitanje.
Da ponovim?
Molim vas, evo.
Koliko smo spremni da kao u nekom periodu posle svega ovoga da pešačimo i vozimo bicikl?
Pa evo, upravo nekoliko stvari tu možemo spomenuti. Prvo bi sam ispravio Marka, nisam doktorirao na tu temu, jesam doktor, ali to je diplomski bio na temu zdravih gradova i da, bavim se tako urbanim zdravljem u mreži hrvatskih zdravih gradova. No što se ove pitanja tiče, dakle, hodanje i vožnja bicikla su stvari vrlo nisko intenzivne tjelesne aktivnosti ukoliko se nigdje ne juri. Dapače, po potrošenim džulima po kilometru manje trošimo energije vozeći bicikl nego hodajući. Tako da upravo i gledanje bicikla kao nekoj aktivnosti koja troši energije je u stvari krivo. Ako vozimo normalnim tempom po normalnim uvjetima, u stvari trošimo manje energije nego hodajući, a hodamo svaki dan i po kući i 15 minuta hoda, mislim da mogu od penzionera pa do ljudi koji su nedavno preboljeli COVID i dapače to i razvija muskulaturu koja dalje omogućuje i duža hodanja i duže vožnje. Tako da u svakom slučaju mislim da je svako ko nema neke tjelesne poteškoće u smislu invaliditeta i može i mora se što više kretati. A na gradskim vlastima i planerima je da omoguće to normalnim prohodnim nogostupima i onda naravno nakon tog i biciklističkim stazama. Evo, a i možda bi tu ima, dakle već se dokazano je da u mnogim državama i u razvijenom i nerazvijenom svijetu urbano stanovništvo duže živi nego ruralno stanovništvo. Tu može biti obrazovanje i pristup zdravstvu jedan od faktora, no činjenica da se ljudi u gradu upravo više pješače, čak i ako su generalno automobilisti, barem će do dućana ili do nečeg otići pješke za razliku od današnjeg ruralnog stanovništva, utječe i na dužinu života sigurno.
Hvala Janko. Valentina, vjerujem da je dio pitanja odgovoreno. Nadam se da ćemo i u nekim drugim webinarima uključiti i zdravstvene djelatnike, da ne bi bilo da pričamo samo sa prometnjacima. Imamo jedno pitanje iz publike, pa mogu ga zapravo odmah postaviti direktno Jeleni kao predstavnici upravo jedinici lokalne samouprave. Pitanje je od kolege Dakića. Zašto se gradovi i općine boje donositi odluke o regulaciji saobraćaja za koje nisu potrebne velika ulaganja ni veliki projekti?
Ovako, znači, prvo je tu pitanje da li postoji prije svega zakonska regulativa, ono što sam već napomenula, da li je dozvoljeno biciklističke trake u kontrasmeru ili ne, ili biciklistička ulica. Tako da ne mogu da kažem da se gradovi boje, jeste stvar političke volje i neki gradovi jesu spremni za primjenu takvih mera. Znači ono što mogu da kažem da već ima nekoliko gradova u Srbiji koje imaju sumpove i postoji blagi porast interesovanja ostalih lokalnih samouprava da krenu u ovom smeru. Znači to jeste spor proces, ali takođe je vrlo bitno ono što je Marko napomenuo, to je i podrška od strane udruženja građana. Eto da kažem, imamo primjer iz Novog Sada gde je upravo udruženje građana pokrenulo inicijativu za pokretanje subvencija za nabavku bicikli, s obzirom da je pre toga bila inicijativa da postoje subvencije za nabavku električnih vozila, a negde je, da kažemo, već dobro poznato da električna vozila ne smanjuju zagađenje što se tiče izduvnih gasova, ali i dalje okupiraju prostor i tako dalje, te da kažemo i to udruženje, da kažemo u saradnji sa lokalnom samoupravom doprinelo da se donese odluka za subvencije za građane. Ima, da kažemo, primjera i mera, kao što sam već rekla, za biciklističke trake u kontrasmeru i u lokalnim samoupravama u Srbiji. Imamo primjer u gradu Pirotu, baš primjena ovih mera, iako zakonski nije regulisano, i kada smo ih pitali zašto su tu meru primenili i da li ima, da kažemo, saobraćajnih nezgoda, jer to negde otprilike argument i ne samo kod donosioca odluka, već i kod planera da primenjuju ovako smele mere. iz Pirota su rekli da je, da kažemo, to mera na koju su već oni navikli duži niz godina, tako da su praktično samo legalizovali tako nešto. Znači, njihovi vozači su navikli da se biciklisti kreću u toj saobraćajnici u kontrasmeru, odnosno dvosmerno, tako da nije bio zabeležen slučaj saobraćajnih nezgoda. Znači, tu negde možemo da kažemo, ajde da tražimo i opravdanje i smelost, znači da ukoliko je već negde, da kažemo, to praksa u pojedinom gradu, pomoći, da kažemo, da se određene mere legalizuju, ali značajno bi poboljšalo i postoje inicijative za izmenu zakona o bezbednosti u saobraćaju i koje se tiču, da kažemo, i biciklističkih traka u kontrasmeru, biciklističkih ulica, ali takođe i regulisanja površine za kretanje električnih trotineta ili romobila, kako ih takođe nazivate. Tako da ono što je takođe primećeno prošle godine, s obzirom da je smanjen broj korisnika javnog prevoza, a da se povećao i broj korisnika električnih trotineta, da to još uvijek zakonom, da kažemo, nije regulisano. Tako da kažemo, eto, zavisi od lokalne samouprave do lokalne samouprave, neke budu smelije u korišćenju mera, a neke druge čekaju zakonska ovlašćenja.
Hvala, Jelena. Aljaž nam se mora isključiti, pa možda da i Aljaži vi komentirate ovo pitanje koje vjerujem da je Jelena dosta sad i uopšte odgovorila Tihomiru Dakiću, tako da se nadam da je dio i odgovoren. A isto tako, Aljaž, možda da se referirate na pitanje koje je postavljeno u četu, da li u regiji postoje neke opcije prometnog eksperimenta gdje NGO i lokalna samouprava zajedno isprobavaju situacije koje inače nisu legalne?
Za prvo pitanje ne bi se u potpunosti složio sa Markom i Jelenom. Ja mislim da se previše fokusa daje pravnom okviru tih mjera u paketu COVID-a. To što smo danas vidjeli, glavnina tih mjera ne treba zakonsku promjenu, nego treba stručnu podršku i političku podršku. Uzimanje trake, ukidanje parkinga, zatvaranje ulice za motorni promet, sve je to moguće u postojećim zakonskim okvirima. I širina ulica isto tako je stvar političke odluke ili stručne odluke, a ne političkih okvira. Tako da mislim da kod tih COVID mjera vratili bi se opet, radili su i gradovi gdje je situacija bila spremna za takve mjere. A što se tiče ovog pitanja oko eksperimenta, ja mislim da u regionu mnogi gradovi već rade te eksperimente. Mogu se nadovesti na moj okolištu u Ljubljani. Dosta stvari je lokalna uprava napravila bez zakonske podrške, kao što je bicikliranje suprotno toku. To je Ljubljana napravila prije nego što je to bilo na nacionalnoj razini dopušteno zakonom. Isto tako uvođenje shared space-a bila je neka siva zona u zakonu, a kroz te eksperimente i politički pritisak onda se promijenila i nacionalni zakon. Tako da te prakse već postoje. Toliko s moje strane. Hvala.
Da, ovo sam spomenuo baš zbog jednog jako dobrog primjera Slovenije u kojem se sjećam da je na razini Ljubljane pokrenuto upravo pitanje kontrasmjera za bicikliste, iako na nacionalnoj razini nije postojalo.
Da. I čujemo priče iz drugih gradova u Europi da glavni gradovi najviše testiraju neka nova rješenja prije nego što im to zakon dopušta i pronađu neku rupu u zakonu za te stvari. Tako da, postoje te prakse.
Gospodine Brezina, baš u kontekstu ovog pitanja, što mislite da je zapravo sada sljedeći najvažniji korak u planiranju prometa nakon pandemije? Što je najbitnije za napraviti, a možda čak i u kontekstu ovog pitanja i velike važnosti eksperimentiranja u prostoru?
I'm not sure if I got the question right due to the translator. I hope so. Did you ask me on when to start or what to start now and how to proceed? Is that correct, Marko? Okay. Well, I would suggest.
Yes. What do you expect
we have to start
as the next
and by starting
step?
now? And by starting now, I don't mean tomorrow or today, but actually yesterday. And when which means actually increasing the speed of implementation on all kinds of levels. What we always see, or very often see, is that there's some kind of, how should I call them, beacon light projects, showcase projects, big projects. There's been one question in the chat, as far as I understood that, is on do we need actually big projects, show-off projects that somehow make the case for that? And I think if you want to become successful with changing transport policies after the pandemics towards the much bigger challenge that it is addressing the climate change and all the aspects that transportation can provide for that, I think there is going to be a switch from big implementation projects to projects that everybody can have a benefit from. I of course understand and I acknowledge that politicians and stakeholders need some kind of projects which can highlight their policies, which can show off that there has been improvement and the agenda is being put forward. But transportation decisions are taking place the step or the moment when somebody steps out of the door and decides on where to go, when to go, and what kind of transport mode to use. So big projects kind of, well, they showcase the agenda, but they are not, from my point of view and from my understanding and from what I've learned from research all over the world, they are not as efficient in changing transport behavior as many small actions in small places where you can get a lot of people benefiting from that. So I would suggest that plenty of small scale improvements with a lot of people profiting from that would absolutely be the starting point. And when we look at the presentations that have highlighted all the impacts that the pandemic has had and the changes that the pandemic has shown to us, I think that the most initial or most prominent point of change would be a change in the allocation of space, because everything that we've seen today was a change in the allocation and the regime of space, which transport mode has got allocated, which kind of space and which amount of space. So I would suggest to start small scale, a large number of small scale implementations of changing space allocation.
Sjajno. Ne znam sad ima li još nekih pitanja iz publike. Ja bih zapravo dozvolio ovdje otvoreno pitanje, odnosno zaključenje cijelog webinara, ne samo panela od strane panelista. Ako nešto želite još za kraj reći, Jelena, Marko, Tadej. Aleksander, you are also invited then.
Evo, ako mogu ja samo kratko, vezano za primjer novih test mera, znači ono što često koristimo kao priliku, to je da u toku obeležavanja Evropske nedelje mobilnosti primenjujemo neku od mera, bilo da su to trajne mere ili test mere. Već vam je možda poznato, mi smo u Kruševcu zatvarali centar grada nekoliko godina u nizu i tu meru produžavali svake godine, što je na kraju dovelo do, da kažemo, promene percepcije, korišćenje javnog prostora i ono što sada imamo, to je rekonstrukcija centra grada i promena režima saobraćaja. Tako da kažemo, treba biti strpljiv i svakako treba koristiti, da kažemo, Evropsku nedelju mobilnosti kao povod za testiranje nekih mera koje to možda nisu zakonom regulisane, ali eto možda se vidi da kažemo, na samoj lokaciji kako bi, da kažemo, takva mera živela u prostoru.
Marko, izvolite.
Evo, ja bih kratko samo rekao, dotaknuo bi se nekih brojki koje sam zaboravio pripomenuti, a radi se o prosječnoj godišnjoj kilometraži osobnih vozila. Znači, imamo podatke od Centra za vozila Hrvatske, bilo je tu riječi u prepisci i nešto se spominjalo tijekom prezentacija. Znači, prosječna kilometraža, govorim za Hrvatsku, Centar za vozila Hrvatske, službeni podatak 12.500 tisuća kilometara 2019. 11.500 tisuća kilometara 2020. Što bi značilo da, iako je bila pandemija, broj vozilo kilometara prosječan se smanjio samo za 8,6%, oko 9%. Znači, ipak, gledajući to, svi smo mislili da je to puno više, ali evo, egzaktni podaci su tu i u pravilu uvijek se trebamo voditi nekakvim podacima, brojkama, što dosta često za jedinice lokalne samouprave ne uspijevamo dobivati. To sad generalno govorim. I evo, još bi možda komentirao od gospodina Lindova, 150 milijuna eura za javni prijevoz, a ništa za nemotorizirani. Evo, to sve govori o nekim gradovima u regiji. Hvala.
Hvala, Marko. Imate li možda neku zaključnu riječ za ovaj naš webinar i za sudionike?
Well, as I said, start yesterday and not wait until tomorrow. Well, this sounds probably a little bit, how to say, marketing style. And I would understand if somebody says, oh my God, what kind of not very realistic suggestion that is from Vienna. I would partially agree with that. But I would like to invite you to just briefly on the perspective that basically science and all these projects, test projects that we've had in the last years and decades, they have shown us what kind of implementation measures there are, how to implement them, and how they basically work. I think the bigger tackle is, and this should be definitely the invitation to start today or yesterday's, actually addressing the implementation barriers. It's not the biggest challenge is not going to be how to design bicycle lanes, but it's how to get all the stakeholders to implement them anywhere where they are needed and in places where they are going to be needed in the future. And I think the addressing of social barriers is that what such webinars and such networks of cities are basically a very fruitful starting point. So start yesterday with addressing the social barriers of implementation.
Hvala vam puno. Ja bih zapravo s ovim sad zatvorio webinar, vidim da je već koncentracija lagano pala. Nemamo više te live događaja u digitalnim opcijama ovih naših webinara, trebamo ići na kraće formate. Ja bih zahvalio svim panelistima, pogotovo gospodinu Tadeju Brezini i isto tako svim prezentatorima. Što se tiče prezentacija, svi sudionici će dobiti mogućnost pregleda svih prezentacija i svih poslanih linkova u chatu. Što više, možete već sada otići na našu stranicu gdje je moja vrijedna kolegica već napravila izvještaj sa webinara gdje imate prezentacije već dostupne. Znači, CIVINET Slovenija, Hrvatska i jugoistočna Europa, možete sve pronaći na webu. I isto tako bi iskoristio kraj ovog webinara da vas pozovem na idući webinar koji će biti 17. ili 18.5. tako da pratite naše vijesti putem CIVINET kanala. Tema idućeg webinara i panel diskusije bit će inovativne tehnologije, elektromobilnost, autonomna vozila, znači sve nove tehnološke inovacije koje nam dolaze u planiranju prometa. Evo, hvala još jednom svima i doviđenja.
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 Doviđenja.